Today on the podcast, we continue the story of Dick Nunis, a person central to the development of Disneyland and of Disney World. Nunis would later play a role in the Disney resorts in Tokyo and Paris. Previously on our podcast, in an 11-part series, we looked at the opening of Walt Disney World, which included Nunis's work on that project. In this series here, we're doubling back to the very beginning to look at Nunis's early years. We've already explored his childhood, his experiences with football, the opening of Disneyland, and his first months and early successes in the park. Now we're moving on to the second half of the 1950s, as Walt worked to expand the park for a larger audience, and Nunis sought to find a larger role for himself inside of this unusual company. So, if you're ready, here we go. During Disneyland's first year, Walt approved a massive expansion of Frontierland, which included the mine train, Tom Sawyer Island, a new Native American village, and the canoes. As web designers were mapping out these upgrades, Walt talked with Nunis about how these changes would affect the area that he supervised, what he felt was needed, and what would make these additions more successful. Ideally, these new attractions would shift guests from Fantasyland, typically an overcrowded area, to Frontierland, a large and typically empty area. Quote, "When I was supervisor of Frontierland and Adventureland, that's when I really got to know Walt," Nunis said. Nunis spent time hiking around an area of Frontierland called the Painted Desert, which would soon hold the mine train, and an area at the back of the park, presently a field of weeds, but soon to be a Native American village and cultural exhibit. Some people working at the park noticed that Walt spent a little more time with Nunis than he did with other area managers. Bill Sullivan recalled, quote, "When Walt did Tom Sawyer Island, he and Dick would walk around the island. They'd come out early in the morning. Walt would say, 'Dick, I want this here, and this here, and this here.' Walt would go back the next day, and Dick saw it was done." These conversations at times were arranged so Nunis could see Walt's design values, not only in Frontierland, but in other areas of the park. While a construction team was developing Tom Sawyer Island and the Native American village in Frontierland, a team of designers was converting the canal boats in Fantasyland into an attraction called Storybook Land. In the original Canal Boats attraction, guests in small boats floated past the Casey Jr. Railroad, as well as dirt banks that, as winter warmed into spring, held nothing but a long line of weeds and crabgrass. In the new attraction, guests in those same boats would float past miniature fairy tale villages. Even though Nunis didn't oversee Fantasyland, Walt included him on planning discussions. Quote, "As we were going through trying to cut the budget," Nunis explained, "the art director said we could use regular glass, not stained glass." The art director then pointed to the location where some of these miniature houses, when finished, would sit. "No one would know the difference." "I will," Walt said, raising a critical eyebrow. "The detail is the thing that makes us. The day we start cutting out detail, we'll just be another amusement park." During these same months, Walt confided in Nunis his overall goal for the park. He wanted Disneyland to radiate the tones of his Midwestern childhood, a type of innocence that he associated with towns far from the rumble and traffic of Los Angeles. More so than the other managers, Nunis understood this intuitively. Nunis had spent his early years in a small town in eastern Georgia, the place where his parents had grown up and lived until the later years of the Depression. Beyond this, Nunis almost surely sensed that Walt Disney's life had been similar in some ways to that of his father. The two men were nearly the same age. Walt had been born in 1901, Doyce Sr. in 1904. They had limited education. Doyce had gone to school through the 6th grade. Walt had gone through the 8th grade. They'd both moved from small towns to large cities, eventually settling in Los Angeles. But Walt wasn't so much of a father figure as he was another mentor, a man 20 or 30 years older than Nunis who, like a football coach or a teacher, could guide him towards success. Only Walt was quickly becoming a master mentor, someone who had accomplished more than all of the other mentors who had come before him. Developing an amusement park with themed lands arranged for families was a learning experience even for Walt. Based on the popularity of the Autopia attraction, Walt designed to build a version of it designed for very young children, primarily for those who were 4 and 5 years old. Walt had it installed at the edge of Fantasyland, a small course called Midget Autopia, in which cars were guided around a track on a central bar. But as Walt soon learned, the ride defeated one of his goals for the park. It wasn't an attraction that could accommodate the whole family. Quote, "Mom and Dad didn't fit on it," Nunis explained. "We took it out after a few years for that very reason." Another area of early concern was how employees contributed to the show unfolding around them. One morning, as Walt moved with Nunis through the park, he signaled out an employee with a tall bouffant hairdo as she walked into the Emporium. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with her hairstyle, only it detracted from the turn-of-the-century presentation of Main Street. "Look," Walt said, "we've got to establish a standard of appearance. You can't go along with a local fad." Nunis understood what his boss wanted, something that would embrace a timeless appeal, a neutral look that would just as easily fit into Main Street as it would Tomorrowland. Now that the park had created a culture of guest-centered satisfaction, the next step was to explore ways that employees could better contribute to the show. Quote, "I went out the next day on Monday," Nunis explained, "and inspected every woman that went to work." He then inspected the men, making sure that they were clean-shaven and their hair was neatly clipped above the ears, hairstyles that didn't call attention to themselves and could just as easily blend into the Wild West as they could Fantasyland. In this way, the central identity of Disneyland employees began to shift from hosts and hostesses to cast members performing roles in a show. As Walt continued to discuss his goals for Disneyland, Nunis gradually became the extension of Walt's authority inside the park. He did his best to anticipate Walt's concerns before he expressed them. He tried to understand Walt's opinions as they were formed. Whenever the boss visited, Nunis didn't simply tell Disneyland employees, or Disneylanders as they were called, to look sharp. He told them to collect information. "The boss is going to be down here this weekend," Nunis would say to his crew. "Tip me off as to what he has to say. I'll buy you a cup of coffee." At times, Nunis's opinion was solicited by Walt, such as when he was looking for ways to repurpose that lagoon over in Tomorrowland, then home to a fleet of you-drive-'em boats. Nunis proposed that the park create a glass-bottom boat attraction in which guests could look down at scenes constructed below the water, something like an underwater dark ride that featured swimmers dressed as mermaids. It would be similar to attractions that existed in Florida. But for the most part, new attractions were created by art directors, architects, and engineers in Burbank, most of whom had risen up out of the world of live-action film production. The person overseeing these artists was Dick Irvine, who had previously worked at Fox. In the Disney organization, these were some of Walt's most important employees, men and women who had the ability to create areas and rides that resembled movie sets. For the most part, these designers stayed in Burbank, far from Disneyland. But down in Anaheim were another group of people who managed and operated the park, Disney employees who talked with guests every day, who understood how attractions might be more efficient and enjoyable. With the exception of one or two high-level Disneyland managers, such as Jack Sayers, people who worked at the park contributed very little in terms of deciding how the park expanded. In the final months of 1957, this division of power was beginning to bother Nunis, that the opinions of art directors were viewed by Walt as far more valuable than that of men and women who worked at the park every day. Instead of a system wherein the importance of park managers grew as Disneyland expanded, Walt and the crowd from WED treated the park as though it were actually a movie set. For a live-action film, the director would review a script with the art director, and together they would decide how various sets would be constructed for key scenes. For Disneyland, Walt, functioning as the director, had similar discussions with art directors about how new areas would be developed without soliciting much, if any, input from managers who spent their lives at Disneyland. To put it in terms familiar to Nunis, the operations team he coached was being unfairly sidelined by the design team over at WED. One afternoon, while sitting at the Plantation House restaurant, looking out at Tom Sawyer Island, Nunis heard his boss say, "Now there's a busy river. What we need is another big boat. This time we should have a replica of the Columbia." Walt gazed out at the water. Nunis knew him well enough to know he was imagining how this ship would look curving around the river. Almost as predictably, Walt peppered this statement with a supporting piece of historical information to make his proposal seem even more enticing. "Did you know," he said, "that was the first American vessel to sail around the world?" Nunis had been waiting for a moment like this, one where he could politely insert his opinion as to how the park should grow, an opinion based on guest feedback gathered by his people in operations. Nunis didn't think that the park would be best served with another attraction that gestured to the history of transportation. In ways, Disneyland, with its paddleboat trains, streetcars, and antique automobiles, was already a living transportation museum. As the baby boomers were growing older, Nunis believed that park guests wanted some type of thrill attraction. Those young children who a few years earlier had been satisfied with the trip around Autopia now wanted something with more action. Nunis suggested that the WED designers develop some kind of thrill attraction, but this idea did not meet with Walt's approval. Instead, he appeared irritated that Nunis's suggestion cut short his daydream about the first American ship to sail around the world. His gaze shifted from the river to Nunis, a 25-year-old manager with shortly clipped blonde hair who sat in the seat across from him. "Damn you, Nunis," he said. "This is Disneyland. We're not going to have a roller coaster. We're not going to have a double Ferris wheel. This is not an amusement park." "No, sir," Nunis ventured. "I realize that, but surely our designers with their creative ability can take a concept and give us a thrill attraction, because that's what we need, sir. That's what the guests are asking for." Walt once more dismissed this idea as he felt that thrill rides were a hallmark of poorly run seaside carnivals. He moved on then to other topics, believing this one finished, and soon after approved plans to add a replica of the sailing ship Columbia to his river. But in the days that followed, he returned to Nunis's idea many times. There was something about it, its directness, its insistence, that stayed with him, that caused him to turn it over in his mind. Though Walt had rejected Nunis's proposal of a thrill ride, similar concepts had previously been proposed by both designers and by Jack Sayers, who, after Woody was fired, oversaw Disneyland. During the park's early design period in 1954, designers had explored the possibility of creating a mild thrill attraction based on the story of Mr. Toad rather than the traditional dark ride it later became. Similarly, in 1956, Jack Sayers had suggested that a new type of roller coaster popular in Europe, a wild mouse coaster, might be arranged to create the type of alpine toboggan ride that Walt wanted in his park. This ride would be part of a Swiss-themed pavilion in a proposed but never built expansion area called International Land. This roller coaster concept lasted for months, but was eventually put aside after one of Walt's people traveled to Europe and took 16mm movies of the ride in action. The Wild Mouse coaster, they decided, was, quote, extremely ugly, and the slow load operations, quote, would make the ride incapable of ever reaching the capacity figure necessary for a park like Disneyland. Eventually, Walt moved on from his plan to build international pavilions towards the back of his park, and with this went the possibility of the Swiss-themed coaster ride. But Walt understood the practicality of what Nunis had recently proposed. Walt wanted his park to interest the whole family, but presently, the attractions mostly interested children and adults, leaving teenagers out of the mix. When Disneyland first opened, the youngest baby boomers were 9 or at most 10 years old. Now, those same kids were becoming teenagers and no longer satisfied with a dark ride based on Peter Pan or a carousel theme to King Arthur. In early 1958, Walt explored the possibility of building that mountain sled ride by itself without the European villages he'd once imagined for that section of the park. He was open to the possibility of this ride system being a coaster, only not the type of wooden roller coaster used at beach-style amusement parks, and not the type of wild mouse coaster with its sharp, flat turns that was currently popular in Europe. Initially, 2 engineers at WED believed that a second-generation wild mouse coaster might deliver such thrills, a ride system that would soon debut at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. Some of the Disney team were already scheduled to visit the fair, as a Disney 360-degree film, America the Beautiful, would be presented at the American Pavilion. 2 of Disney's key managers, Joe Fowler, who oversaw construction at Disneyland, and Roger Broggie, Disney's lead engineer, spent time observing this new coaster. Unlike a traditional coaster, this system had 3 rails, 2 side rails, and a raised center rail to better stabilize the vehicle during banked turns and twists. The track was arranged as a triangle, with the bottom of each coaster angled like an inverted V to perfectly fit atop it. Though their research notes and impressions are now lost to history, their study was recorded by Broggie's personal camera, with many photos capturing how this coaster worked, from the rails to the bogie system to the wheels to the cars themselves. Eventually, WED designers decided that this coaster concept, like the Wild Mouse system before it, wasn't right for a toboggan ride. But seeing an experimental coaster so different than earlier systems freed up their imagination to wonder if they might create their own coaster system to simulate the ride experience of gliding over snow. In Burbank, the WED designers created their own experimental system. At the same time, up in San Jose, a ride design company regularly used by Disney, Aero Development, created a second experimental coaster system with the belief that one of these experimental systems would provide a sled-like thrill ride. The process overall moved Disneyland toward having a type of Swiss-themed coaster, though the specifics would need to be worked out as the project moved forward. As designs for a mountain coaster fell into place, likely mid-1958, Walt called Nunis over to his table in the employees' cafeteria. "Hey, Nunis," he said, "get up here." Not sure how to interpret Walt's tone, Nunis slowly moved to the head of the table, where Joe Fowler offered him the seat next to Walt. "When's your birthday?" Walt asked. "Well, sir, it's May." "I'm going to give you an early birthday present," Walt added. "You're going to get your thrill attraction. We're going to build a scale model of the Matterhorn and put a bobsled in it." Nunis thanked Walt and was surprised that his suggestion, offered months earlier, had now resulted in a thrill ride coming to Disneyland. The Matterhorn would be part of a major expansion in Tomorrowland, which also included a submarine attraction. This was ultimately the solution as to how the park should repurpose its lagoon, though here too this attraction would pick up one idea Nunis had originally proposed for those glass-bottom boat rides. During the early part of the voyage, at least during its early years, guests looking out porthole windows would see live girls dressed in mermaid tails swimming through the water, just as they did at roadside attractions in Florida. As designs for this area developed, these two attractions would be joined by a third, an experimental monorail that WED designers had located in Germany. The Matterhorn itself was designed by artists at WED, who created multiple models that became the basis for the actual Matterhorn built by the American Bridge Company just next to the castle. Walt insisted that the ride be smooth, like a toboggan ride gliding down snow. With this, Aero Development created an experimental coaster that used urethane wheels spinning over tubes as opposed to metal wheels rolling over rails. In doing so, they developed the first modern roller coaster. In the park, day by day, Nunis watched as the back half of Tomorrowland began to transform itself. First, the bucket cars were removed from the Skyway cable. Next, the Skyway cable and the support towers were removed as well. A construction wall went up from the back of the castle to the far end of the park. At its front was posted a concept painting of what would soon be built behind this fence. From there, the ground was leveled, the old lagoon was drained and dug out in preparation for a massive cement-lined pool through which submarines would voyage. Next to the lagoon, a platform was built for a last-minute addition to the project, a monorail that would glide above the park as an example of near-future transportation that Walt hoped might soon transform the American city. As for the Matterhorn itself, first went up the skeletal steel, much of it lifted into place by a long-reach crane. The metal offered a vague outline of how the mountain would appear when finished, like stars in the nighttime sky suggesting a constellation. Next came the roller coaster track, actually two separate tracks that curved in and around the steel. Once the circuit was complete, Aero ran a test car through the steel mountain, with the car moving around beams and sliding down into the open center of the structure. In the front of the test car was a handbrake, as the track didn't yet have glacial pools to slow the cars as they came to the end of the ride. Once the ride system was in place, plywood was placed around the cap of the mountain, along with wire to sculpt its shape. For a while, the Matterhorn appeared as a strange fantasy. The bottom two-thirds were nothing more than steel. Nunis could even see from one side of the structure through to the other. But the upper third, finished with wood, plaster, and paint, appeared as a snowy peak. It was a mountain cap, with its rockwork complete, lifted by metal stilts 100 feet into the sky. Around the mountainous structure, another set of cranes lifted beams into place to create a monorail track, and in the lagoon pit, not yet filled with water, craftspeople painted structures to resemble coral reefs and the type of rock formations that exist on the ocean floor. As for the Matterhorn, plywood along with a wire frame for rockwork was added to the mountain from the cap moving down, like a mountain whose existence started in the clouds and magically, over months, extended down to earth. Miniature trees were dropped down into planter pockets halfway up the structure. The glacial pools along with the waterfall structures were filled with water. And finally, a line of roller coaster sleds were added to the track. The zone brake system was tested, which allowed multiple sleds on each track at the same time. In theory, each of the two tracks should allow for 30 sleds, but in easing the ride into service, Aero didn't feel comfortable placing more than a handful of sleds on each track until they were convinced that both the zone system and the operators could handle a larger number. In those final weeks, as guests entered the park, they were given handbills featuring illustrations of the Matterhorn, the submarine, and the monorail. Quote, "Don't miss the greatest construction show on Earth," the handbills proclaimed, leaving guests to wonder at what was being developed on the other side of those construction walls. In preparation for another press event, artists at the studio designed a set of floats. Like parade units from the 1955 grand opening, these floats as well would allow the park to celebrate itself. One featured the Matterhorn, another a submarine. Floats elaborately designed, yet like those from the 1955 opening, would only be used once, during the press day ceremonies. The highlight of the parade, however, would be a marching band led by 76 trombones. On TV, the band would be conducted by Meredith Willson as they played the signature number from his hit musical The Music Man, a song also called 76 Trombones. The band, filled out with local musicians, held one rehearsal inside the park on Sunday, June 7th. On that morning, visitors arriving early to the park were able to watch them rehearse, with their wide flanks moving up Main Street. Later that week, in the days leading up to the opening on Tuesday and Wednesday, ABC camera crews filmed in the park, taking in footage of alpine climbers working their way up the artificial mountain and subs moving through the lagoon. In 1955, Walt had learned an important lesson about the unpredictability of live telecasts. This time, camera crews would capture footage early, record the opening day events, and then over the following 3 days, edit those elements together to better control the image that ultimately was broadcast on TV. The Matterhorn, the submarine voyage, along with the monorail all opened on the same day, June 14, 1959. For Walt, this was an attempt to further distance Disneyland from the traditional amusement parks that now, as America continued to focus on leisure, were popping up around the country. There was one Disneyland-style park complete with a western area just outside of Denver, and another with a western area and something that resembled Main Street, soon to open near Boston. Walt's office kept tabs on the competition with an eye toward ensuring that Disneyland itself, through a depth of design and engineering wonders, stayed one step ahead of its competition. On the day that the Matterhorn, the monorail, and submarine voyage were presented to the press, Nunis himself was one of two people who oversaw crowd control for the opening ceremonies. He seated members of the press for the parade, watching as floats moved down Main Street. The climax of the parade was the band, the massive brass lines surging into the park as streamers and confetti rained down around them. The tones of the parade were grander, more exuberant than the musical performances that so far had ventured into the park. After the parade, Nunis talked with VIP guests and various reporters about new rides. He made sure that TV cameras had access to key events. In ways, the day reminded him of Black Sunday, when the park premiered to the world through the miracle of live TV. Only now the press event was far better managed, and the TV show wasn't live. Likewise, Walt was more confident of both himself and his park. Submarine Voyage had been loading guests for days without problems. The coaster system on the Matterhorn, even if craftspeople were still finishing small aspects of the mountain and others were finalizing planter areas, had proven reliable. This left the monorail, which would break down once on opening day, leaving passengers, including Walt, stranded on the beam for roughly an hour. But this problem was minor compared to the ride breakdowns, equipment failures, and overcrowding of the park's grand opening. To one reporter, Walt said, "We expect 5 million people this year." Then he gestured off to recently opened attractions. "We keep adding things, but the increase in attendance each year fills the older ones and the new ones too." Another reporter from the Los Angeles Mirror, who 4 years earlier had focused on the park's shortcomings, went out of his way to praise this event, saying, quote, "The press preview, incidentally, was the smoothest handled of its kind that I've ever seen." As Nunis moved through the park, he could feel that the quiet little enterprise that he had helped open was not so quiet anymore. It was something larger with a deeper sense of meaning. In the center of this wonderful expansion was an attraction that he had in part suggested. At least he had suggested the general goal of creating a thrill ride. As far as he could tell, everyone who rode it at the press party loved it. Beyond this, there was something else about the day, something more personal. His life was moving in a direction that years ago he couldn't have imagined. The image of himself as a directed teacher was fading into the past, as were his dreams to coach football. He still loved the sport and was fascinated by its intricacies and strategies, but he was a different person now. That old vision of himself was being replaced by something new. A vision in which he managed a team of park employees who worked as hosts, created a type of ongoing show, and represented the values of Walt Disney. But beyond this, there was something more. A bristling quality, a sense of competition, a need to prove himself alongside designers and other people who worked at WED. The Matterhorn, as far as he could tell, would turn out to be a success. A sign that proposals rising up out of operations should be considered as seriously as those that came from artists who once designed sets for MGM and Fox. Life was a strange journey he was discovering, in which the person you wanted to be wasn't necessarily the person you became. Yet he was enjoying this experience working inside of this unusual park. Disneyland was known across the country. Whenever he met someone, they knew exactly what Disneyland was. Yet he felt there was still room for him to grow, to become something beyond the supervisor of Frontierland and Adventureland, to play a larger role as this park continued to expand. I'll be back next week with a new episode that continues our story of Walt Disney and Dick Nunis as Disneyland continues to expand into the 1960s and as an operation team takes on the challenge of overseeing one of the Disney attractions at the New York World's Fair. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.